what age children need to start keeping Shabbat, not doing muktzah, not doing things on Shabbos. So in order to address that, what I'd like to do is sort of set out a couple of principles that I think will really be useful, and then we'll give some examples and applications. So the first principle, we're going to call it principle number one, is, the first principle is chosen because it's, I think, the most familiar principle that we know about relating to children with mitzvot in general. And I didn't write down where the source is because it actually appears in a few places. Katan she'ein tzarich li'imo chayav b'sukkah. A child who doesn't need his mother is obligated to sit in the sukkah. When it says a child who doesn't need his mother, obviously everyone needs their mother. It means a child who could eat on his own without his parents, so he's obligated to go eat in the sukkah. If he's too young that he needs to be fed by his parents, he does not need to go in the sukkah. Yodei l'narneya chayav b'lulav. If he knows how to shake the lulav, he has to take a lulav. Yodei l'hitatev. If he knows how to get dressed, chayav b'tzitzis. Yodei l'daber aviv milamdo shma v'torah v'lashon hakodesh. If he knows how to speak, he should be taught Shema, Kriyat Shema, Torah, and Hebrew. Not every version has this phrase, but Yodea l'shmor tefillin, aviv lokech lo tefillin. If he knows how to respect his tefillin, he should get him tefillin. Yodea l'shmor gufo, ochlan al gufo taharos. If he knows how to protect his body from impurity, then he should whatever, he can hold taros. That's not for us. But basically the principle here is that each mitzvah is different, but at any age that a child knows how to understand how to perform a mitzvah, they're obligated to do the mitzvah. And this is a very important detail here that's not said explicitly. This is a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, meaning we know that the Torah says a child has to do mitzvah when they're 12 and 13 years old, bar bat mitzvah. Here, the halacha says that the Chachamim said, don't wait till you're 12 and 13. Could you imagine if they followed the law of the Torah, that no kids did any mitzvah until they're bar bat mitzvah at all? So it's saying, no, as soon as they know how to do the mitzvahs, they should start doing it as a training, to know how to do it well and to be used to it when their bar mitzvah comes. But before they know how to do the mitzvah, then they don't need to keep anything. Okay. Now, that's principle number one. Principle number two. Principle number two says the following. And this is a little bit more complicated, but Tashma, lo ta'achilum ki sheketzein. This is a Gemara quoting a pasuk which says that you can't eat bugs, different insects. Lo tochlum, don't eat them. The Midrash says, lo ta'achilum, don't cause others to eat. Lehazhir gedolim al ktanim, which means that adults are responsible to ensure that children don't eat these non-kosher insects. My love de amrluhu lo tochlu. Does this mean you should tell them don't eat? Lo does not mean that. You do not need to tell them not to eat. De lo leisfulei biyadayim. What it means is you can't feed them. This is a very important principle that when it comes to non-kosher, if you have a young child, you don't have to tell them not to eat the bug. If they're out in the yard and they're eating bugs or whatever they're doing with the bugs, you don't need to tell them to stop, but don't feed it to them. That's case number one. Case number two, kol nefesh mikem lo tochlu dam. All people should not eat blood. So the Midrash says that the word kol comes to say lahazhir gdolim al ktanim, that adults are obligated to make sure that kids don't eat blood either. My lav da amri lahu lo tochel. Does this mean you should tell them don't eat blood? No, you don't need to tell them not to eat the blood. If kids are going and eating blood, you don't need to stop them and say, oh, it's not kosher. But you just shouldn't feed them blood. Hope everyone's keeping that one. Tashma, Emor via Marta. This is Parshat Emor. Emor el kohanim bnei Aaron via Marta alehem lenefesh lo yitama be'amad. So the word Emor is repeated in the pasuk to say, tell the kohanim and tell them not to become tamei. Lahazhir gdolim al ktanim. My love to amrlu lo tamu, to tell your kids don't become tamei. No. The lo tamu will be a dayan. That if a child is becoming tamei, you don't have to stop him, but you can't cause a child to be tamei, meaning you can't bring a Kohen child into a cemetery because he'll be tamei. So this is principle number 2. Principle number 1 is once a child is old enough to know how to do mitzvot, you have to train them to do them. Principle number 2 is that when it comes to averot, you don't necessarily have to tell them not to, but you can't feed them averot. And this is considered to be a paradigm for all averot, not just these 3. Minimally, kashrut and tumat kohanim, and the Midrash adds another example, which is from Shabbat. It says in the Torah, Ata uvincha v'techa avdecha v'yamascha v'yamtecha v'kercha asher v'sharecha, that no one should work on Shabbos, you or your children. Yachal b'no ubito hagdolim. The word yachal means you might mistakenly interpret the pasuk to refer to a ben or a bat who's adult or over bar bat mitzvah. That can't be, because shu omer ata, it says ata uvanecha vitcha. So harei b'no uvito hagdolim amurim. When it says ata, it's a great line of Midrash. When it says ata, who's you? Not just you. You is you and you and you and you, all Jews. So children who are bar bat mitzvah, they're part of that ta. So who's banecha v'techa? Matam lomer banecha v'techa. Elu b'no ubito katanim. This is your son and daughter who are less than bar bat mitzvah. Shelo yomar levno katan hachnisli kli zem and ashuk hachnisli kalkala zum and ashuk. You shouldn't tell your children who are under bar bat mitzvah, carry this for me from the street, which you can't do on Shabbos to carry. You can't tell them not to do work on Shabbos. You might think that you should run after them, telling them not to do malacha. Tamalomar ata ma'ato midat atzmacha melechet atzmacha avhein midat atzman melechet atzman. So no, they're responsible for themselves. You don't need to tell your children not to do malacha. You just can't tell them. So this is a similar idea as the previous 3 examples. You can't tell them not to do. You can't tell them to do malacha, but you don't need to stop them if they're doing it themselves. So that's principle number 2. Applying that to Shabbos. So the 2 principles are basically saying. Number 1, if a child is old enough to understand how to keep the mitzvot, you should, if he's old enough to know how to keep the mitzvot, you should train him and tell him or her to do them. And if they're younger, you don't need to tell them to stop, but you can't feed them the aveira. You can't tell them to do it for you. Okay, that's principle number 2. Principle number 3 is the most hardest to quantify, and I don't even think that people would all formulate it as this, but I think that there's a very important 3rd principle, which is mitzvah ba'alma, which means just a mitzvah, meaning that it's just, even if it doesn't fit into those rules of chinuch and ein ma'achilin to the child, it could be that it's just the right Shabbos environment to have Shabbos observed by everyone in the home, even if they're not strictly obligated based on the specific first two rules. This one is hard to quantify, but I think there's a lot of evidence that poskim believe in it and apply it. And I'll show you what I mean. Okay, and here's my favorite story on this topic, which is in the Gemara. And the Gemara tells a story. You can't make this stuff up. Rav Yitzchak bar Bisna irchasu le mifteche divei midrasha b'shus harabim. I mean, this is like the paradigm story of Judaism. So this rabbi lost the keys to the shul, or left them in the street, and there's no eruv. So basically, shul's closed because they don't have the keys to the shul, and they don't have an eruv. Ata lekame de Rav Padat. So they went to Rav Padat looking for some good advice. Amr le zil davar tali vitalia vilatailu. Go and bring young boys and girls. Let them walk there where the keys were lost. If they'll find the keys, they'll bring it to you. So you tell the kids, come play here. They see the key, they're going to come running to show it to you. And then you stand by the door, they come to the door, put it in the door, and it works. So this is like sort of the illustration of, you would never, tell them to violate Shabbos. You would never tell the child, carry the keys to me on Shabbos. That's what we just said. You can't do that. But you could say, go play here. And if all of a sudden they walk over to you with the keys, it's all good. And maybe when they bring it to you, you should probably, they don't say this in the Gemara, but when they bring it to you, you should say, next time, just don't carry without an eruv. And make it into a learning experience. And so I think that I'll give you some examples how to apply it in a second, but this is how the Shulchan Aruch paskins that Katan could keep not kosher. You don't have to stop him, but you should try to educate him, and you shouldn't asur lahargilo b'chilo Shabbos and maved. You shouldn't get him into the habit of violating Shabbos until he's old enough to know. Once he's a gila chinuch, you teach him. Here the Shulchan Aruch says, and this is where he introduces that last category, a child who hits his father or did another avera, afal pi she'ein tzarich tshuva k'sheyag igadel, mikol makom tov lo she'yikabel al atzmo ezo davar l'tshuva l'kapara. A child who does some sins, and then he gets older, and then he starts to feel really regretful for what he did as a child. So technically, he doesn't need tshuva because when he did it, he didn't know any better. And he wasn't obligated. He wasn't bar mitzvah. But he really should do a little bit of tshuva. And the Mishnah Berurah says, Lifnim Mishuras Hadin, if you want to go a little bit beyond the letter of the law, he should really pay back. If he did a damage, if you remember when you were a kid, you went into a store and you broke something. So even though technically the store owner couldn't sue you and couldn't collect any damages from you, now that you're older, you did it, it is a lifnim mishuras hadin, because in other words, even though technically you weren't obligated, you really sort of should try to keep these mitzvot and not do these things. What do you do when you need some help on Shabbos? who are you going to call? The Shabbos guy is like one of the most, basic parts of Judaism that, and the question is whether your child could be your Shabbos guy or someone else's child. Maybe we have a new kind of a Shabbos guy. And people do treat their children as a Shabbos guy. Much more convenient because this way, your Shabbos guy is in your house for you. If you ever leave a light on or off that needs to be changed, you just call them over. And the question is, what's really better, the Shabbos guy or your child? And here, I think that there are some important clarifications that need to be made, because, if the child is old enough that he is at the age of chinuch where he knows what it means to keep Shabbos, obviously you should educate him to keep Shabbos and not to violate Shabbos for you. But even if the child is younger and doesn't really know very much, or couldn't really understand what the laws of Shabbos are like, you still can't tell him to violate Shabbos. You can't tell the child to violate Shabbos. So you can't tell the child to turn off the light. You can't hold the child next to the light and tell him, just press this, because then you're telling him to violate Shabbos. And even if he's 1 year old, you're still doing that. What can you do? So I take that story about the keys of the shul as a paradigm. You can hold a young child next to a light switch and just see if he wants to play with it. You don't have to say, press it, or you shouldn't tell him to press it, but you could hold him next to the light switch for a couple of minutes and see if he wants to play with it. And once he does it, you could remove him. So I think that would be okay. But you cannot tell the child to break Shabbos. Now, another thing is that there's also a big misconception about Shabbos Goy, even though Shabbos Goy is something that is like very culturally acceptable. Really, it's not so simple, because you're not really supposed to ask non-Jewish people to do things for you. On Shabbos, you're not really, anything that you're not allowed to do yourself, you're not really supposed to ask someone who's not Jewish to do for you. There are some exceptions, which is why it exists, and mostly the rules are not so well known, so people sort of mess up. But just to give it one or two examples, if someone's sick, you can have a non-Jew do anything for you, even if it's not life-threatening. So if someone's in a hospital, so presumably they're sick. So if someone's in the hospital on Shabbos and the lights are on and it's hard for them to sleep, they can ask someone who's not Jewish who works there to turn the light off, because they're making the sick person more comfortable. So if someone's sick, you can ask a non-Jew to do anything for you, because it's a rabbinic law not to ask non-Jews to do work for you, so they suspended it in the case of illness. So there are other examples. I'll just mention one other. If someone's very hot or very cold, that's also equivalent to being sick. So if someone, the heat goes off, so in the winter, or even if it's the air conditioner goes off and it's really like today, so you could be in a category of sick and have a non-Jew switch it for you. So there are other examples as well when it's allowed, but really the rule of thumb is that the Shabbos Goy is a misconception. It's not really allowed. I want to discuss a couple of exceptions, but let me start with this one. Here's a picture of a muksa toy. A muksa toy. A toy, people use the word muksa toy, is a toy that makes sounds, that does something that you're not supposed to use on Shabbos. A toy that has batteries. So that's a muksa toy. So people, I'm not saying who, people have a habit of putting away all the muksa toys for Shabbos, which is a fine thing to do. I have no problem with that. However, I think that it's not necessarily necessary for young children. If a child is like 3 or 4 and they don't really know what muksa is, so I don't think necessarily you have to go through your house and clear away all the muksa toys. But let's just say there's a muksa toy out on the floor and the child goes over to it and is about to press, the buttons or whatever, and everyone yells out, muksa! So I think that's a really big mistake because you don't have to do that, right? You don't have to, unless if the child is 10 years old and they learned, 39 malachos of Shabbos in school this year, so then of course you should tell them you shouldn't do that. But the child is 3, 4, 5, 6 years old and they don't really know what that means. There's no mitzvah to tell them to stop. You shouldn't tell them to use it. You shouldn't give it to them and say, here, go play with this. But you don't need to stop them. So you let them play. Just let them play. That's the principle. Let the child play. So that's one thing. And the other reason why it's a mistake is because we call everything muksa, because the child is too young to understand, this is the malacha of dash. So we just call everything muksa. So they think every law of Shabbos is really muksa. That was last week's class. Not everything is about muksa. But we don't need to teach them that misconception about muksa. And we don't need to teach them that Shabbos is so prohibitive, because I really think it can be damaging. Now, if you have a toy like this, these little cars that you drive, and your kid is like going out to drive down the block on Shabbos, so I think that most people would feel that that's sort of not the environment of Shabbos you want to have. So I think when it comes to that third category of mitzvah ba'alma, of setting an environment for Shabbos, I think that we could say, we don't use that toy on Shabbos. But when a child is playing on the floor and the toy is muksa, it's really fine to let them play. Don't tell them to use it. Don't tell them not to use it. Let them just play. Then some parents might make a mistake in going to run over and pick it up and put it on a high shelf. That would be even worse, because then you're violating muksa to prevent the child from doing something which they were actually allowed to do. So just leave it and let them play and enjoy the day. I want to give another example of a lesser known halacha. We'll just get another little halacha here in tonight, because not everyone knows this. You're not supposed to use a tree on Shabbos. This is a quote from the Shulchan Aruch. Asar lihishtamesh b'tzadadei ha'ilan. You can't use a tree. We're afraid you're going to pull something off of the tree. It's a rabbinic law. And you can't use the tzadadei ha'ilan. You can't use things on the tree. Aval b'tzadadei tzadadei mutter. But something attached to a tree, that's permissible. So this picture, this kid is climbing up a tree. So first of all, if you're not allowed to climb a tree on Shabbos. You're not allowed to climb a tree on Shabbos, even though it feels like, it's not muksa, it's not electrical. You're not supposed to climb a tree on Shabbos. If a child is climbing a tree, if they're young, you don't need to tell them to stop if it's safe. But you shouldn't tell them go climb a tree, because that's actually something which is not allowed on Shabbos. And just to elucidate this case, so these ropes that are tied to the tree to make it easier to climb, this is called tzadadei ha'ilan. So you're not allowed to climb on these ropes either, because you can't use something attached to a tree on Shabbos. Now, here, what you have is this black thing. This looks like a hammock or a zip line. So the black bracket is attached to the tree. So that's the tzedadeh ilan. You're not allowed to use this black bracket on Shabbos. This wire is tzedadeh tzedadin. It's attached to something attached to the tree, so you can't use that. Then this rope, actually, you could use because it's attached to something to the tree. So that's okay. So that's the law of trees on Shabbos. Here's another example. You're not allowed to lean on a tree on Shabbos. So this person's doing this. This picture was taken on a weekday. You're not allowed to lean on a tree on Shabbos. If you're zip lining on a rope attached to a tree, so I think that, again, like this, I don't see the attachment to the tree, but let's assume this rope is tied directly to the tree. So this would be the tzedadeh ha'ilan. However, the zip line would be tzedadeh tzedadeh. So that would be okay. Here's someone hung up their jacket on the tree. This you're not allowed to do on Shabbos. Here, there's a hanger attached to the tree. So the hanger, you can't hang something on this hanger because the hanger is attached to the tree. If you find a jacket, so you can't hang a jacket on a hanger on a tree because it's only one step removed. However, if you find a jacket on a hanger on a tree and you want to put your candy bar in the pocket of the jacket, so you're allowed to use the jacket. Okay. So, again, I wanted to just highlight this halacha because it's a lesser known Shabbos law. But as far as kids, again, the principle is if a kid is too young to really understand, let him climb as long as it's safe. If don't tell him to climb. If he's old enough to understand the halachos of Shabbos, then you could educate him and say, you can't really do this on Shabbos, and tell him why. Okay, we did this. Here is the mitzvah of Shabbos, the 2 times in the Torah. In Yisro and Vaschana, the 2 Aseret Dibros, and I think it's significant that the first one is Zachor. Zachor is the positive to remember that it's Shabbos, which refers halachically to Kiddush. And the second one is Shamor, is to guard it, which means to not do work on Shabbos. And I think it's really important that when it comes to educating children about Shabbos, we follow the same sequence and we start with the positive and then later come to the negative of what you can't do. But really a lot of times we make a mistake and we just start with the negative of all the things that you can't do, and then they think it's all about negatives. And then they don't want to keep Shabbos. And why should you create a negative feeling about Shabbos for a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old? And like, this is the day that everything's muksa. Everything I like is called muksa. I don't know what muksa means, but it means that everything I like is not allowed. So, focus on the zachor, focus on the positive, which means not only kiddush, but also drinking the grape juice. And not only drinking the grape juice, but enjoying the positive aspects of Shabbos, having good food, having fun, and making it a positive. That's really what the halacha says. And it's also better educationally. And Shira wants to add that they'll remember when they're older and they'll appreciate Shabbos when they get older. And I also want to, what do you want to say? And then they'll also appreciate the not working when they're old enough to nap, and then they'll be happy with they'll be happier with not working. And
Rabbi?
Yeah.
What happens if they, to your point about like sort of making Shabbos a positive experience, what happens like sometimes the kids get behind, this thing is muksa or this is not, right? All their siblings or whatever it is. If they say something that's not actually correct, is there a need to correct them at that point in time if they're doing it with sort of a positive kind of, protecting the Shabbos, or should you correct them?
Could you give me an example? I'm not sure what you mean. Like
I mean, like they tell their sister they can't do something that they can.
they tell them something that's wrong inherently, or they tell them it's wrong.
It's muksa. It's like whatever it is, or don't do this because it's muksa when it's actually not muksa.
Well, if it's actually not muksa, I think you should teach them.
Correct them.
Yeah, definitely. But I thought you were going to say something else. And then the older kids tells the younger kids, you can't do that because it's muksa, and you're like, they're 3 years old. They're allowed to, and they're like, what? So there might be a need to explain.
Yeah, there's that too. Yeah.
Yeah. And I also want to share with you a wonderful minhag that my wife brought to my family, which is, which is what? Who knows?
Donuts.
Entenmann's donuts. We have a minhag that we get a box of donuts every Shabbos, and there's enough for almost every person in the family can get one donut. And it could be the simplest thing, but you just make it special for Shabbos, and you never get it during the week, and you always get it on Shabbos. And every Friday we say tomorrow you're getting a donut, and it just makes Shabbos something that you look forward to, and not something that's difficult. And then you just don't have to focus on what we're not doing before it's necessary. So make it positive and educate age appropriately until they can appreciate it, and hopefully we can also appreciate it. But thank you for your attention. If anyone has any comments or questions now or any other time, you're welcome.
I just have a question about the tree. I don't think you went into why. What's the issue with
the issue with the tree is that you might cut something off the tree or break something off the tree, which would be a malacha. If it doesn't seem intuitive, that's probably why no one really remembers this halacha. But I mean, it just doesn't seem like something we might do instinctively. But that's a concern that either you'll forget and you'll pull something off the tree, or you'll just inadvertently pull something off the tree and violate that malacha.
Then I assume that would apply to bushes too, not to lean on a bush or whatever.
I believe so.
Wait, not to sit on grass, because then you might pull the grass
Exactly,
out.
grass. No, you're allowed to walk on grass.
No, but I feel anytime I sit on grass, I'm for some reason wanting to pull it out. I don't know why.
Yeah.
That same thing with Benji's hair. Anytime I'm near him, I just want to pull it. Just kidding. Never mind.
I feel the same way with Benji.
That's where it went? Yeah. No, I assume it's true about bushes, but it's not like, I'm not really sure. Like if plants have that. But yeah. Okay. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi Shilowitz.
Have a great night. We'll pick up next week.
Have a good night. Good night, everybody.